Good day. Before I commence this video, I would just like to inform you all of an important recent development with the Duran and indeed also with his channel. We are now on Rumble's homepage, and moreover my channel is also now available and can be viewed on Rumble. If you go to Rumble's homepage, you can type me in the search button and you will find me. And if you watch either the Duran or my channel on Rumble or Alex Christophorou's channel, which is also there, then you will also find at the top a red maroon button which you can press, and that will take you straight to our locals page as well. And of course, locals is where we now have a thriving community, many of whom publish their own exclusive content, where we publish exclusive content, that's to say Alex and I, and where I do live streams every Wednesday. And you can join us that way via Rumble if you want to follow us through Rumble. And of course, Rumble is now increasingly becoming a force in social media, and one which we are extremely excited to be involved in, just as we are extremely excited to be involved in locals. So that's just that point about Rumble and locals, and now I will proceed with today's video. And today's video is about the latest statements about the crisis in Europe, which are now coming from China. And I'm going to say something in advance of my discussion of these statements from China, which are extremely interesting, full of insight, and give a very clear idea of Chinese policy. But there is another aspect to these statements from China which is of historic, I would say of epochal significance, because this is the first time since, well, the 13th century, when the Mongol armies marched into Hungary, that an East Asian state has expressed opinions and played a role, however indirect, in European affairs. And that is something that is a major shift in world affairs. It tells us that the world is indeed changing. It is as important an event in some respects as was the involvement of the United States, the interest that the United States began to show in the affairs of Europe at the start of the 20th century. We now see China, the rising great power in the East, starting to show a similar interest in the affairs of Europe to the one that the United States once did. And as I said, there's never been anything quite like this. Japan, of course, was allied with Germany during the Second World War, but its overwhelming focus was on the events in the Pacific. China, by contrast, is now taking an active role in European politics. It's in dialogue with Germany. It's putting increasingly effective economic pressure on Lithuania, a topic which I will come back to in another program. And it is now weighing in on the whole crisis in Ukraine, and it is doing so in a way that is meaningful and effective, even though at the moment it is still, because of the distance of geography, a peripheral player. But of course that may change, just as the US's original tentative involvement in European affairs in the early 20th century evolved gradually and became, of course, seminally important as it is to this day. It's not inconceivable that we could see Chinese involvement in Europe start to follow the same trajectory. Anyway, having got past that introduction, let's see what the Chinese are saying. And what has made me make this program is a very powerful, very insightful editorial which has appeared in Global Times, the Chinese newspaper, which is published as well as in Chinese in the English language, and in which the Chinese government often ventilates its private thoughts, thoughts which it's not willing to publish in more official newspapers like the People's Daily and the Xinhua News Agency. Though I would reiterate again that Global Times is actually owned by the People's Daily, which is the official newspaper of the Chinese Communist Party, so it is only a step removed from the Chinese government itself. Anyway, this is what the Global Times editorial has to say. I'm going to read it out in full, and then I'm going to make some observations about it. And the title of the editorial is Furthest from Ukraine Frontline, Washington is Most Eager for War. And the editorial then goes on to say, US President Joe Biden recently approved the deployment of 3,000 US troops to the eastern part of Europe. The first batch has arrived in Germany and Poland. This is an eye-offending move the US made after it withdrew its troops from Afghanistan and Iraq. Now that's a cruel rejoinder, if ever there was one. The Chinese subtly reminding everybody about how the US has been forced in effect to pull troops out of Afghanistan and Iraq, and it's insinuating that they're being redeployed to Europe. So anyway, to continue, the Pentagon previously announced that 8,500 US troops are placed on heightened alert to possibly deploy to Eastern Europe. In addition, NATO defense ministers will discuss further reinforcement at their next meeting on February 16th and 17th. Although these troops are not deployed directly in Ukraine, the move has de facto made people think Eastern Europe is on the brink of war. Washington, it must be noted, is furthest away from the Ukrainian front line, but it is most eager for a war, whilst both Russia and Ukraine have repeatedly announced that they have no intention of going to war or solving their problems by force. Ukraine's president and defense minister publicly stated that the situation is not as tense as the United States has portrayed. But Washington, which is far away from the region, has been hyping that war is on the verge of breaking out. US media Bloomberg has even released fake news that live Russia invades Ukraine. The US has not only fanned the flames of public opinion, but also provided arms to Ukraine and enhanced military deployment around the European country. The US's intention is to urge Ukraine to hold on and not fall behind in its confrontation with Russia. Washington intends to instigate wars in a bid to increase the legitimacy of NATO's existence and the bloc's internal cohesion, to tie Europe, which has shown some signs of departing from Washington, more tightly to the United States. Some other analysts say the US can take the opportunity to sell arms a reasonable suspicion based on history. In short, the United States is trying to hit various birds with one stone, but it is playing an immoral and dangerous game. The New York Times reported that even many reliably hawkish voices in both parties show no appetite for seeing US troops fight and potentially die for Ukraine. The US is pushing Ukraine into the firing line, but it itself has jumped aside to avoid being implicated. One of Washington's aims is to make Russia feel uncomfortable, but Ukraine is very likely to become the victim. Anyone with a discerning eye can figure out that the last thing Ukraine really needs is arms. The US is donating or selling weapons to Ukraine cannot change the military balance between Russia and Ukraine. What Ukraine does need is a peaceful and stable internal and external environment. The country has to focus on developing its economy, improving people's livelihoods, and easing tensions with Russia. If the US stands with Ukraine, as it has claimed, it should have provided Ukraine the necessary and substantial help in these fields. It needs to be underlined that the most difficult thing for Ukraine to withstand right now is to add fuel to the fire, but Washington has repeatedly created opportunities to escalate the situation between Russia and Ukraine. In this context, the latest joint statement that China and Russia have released also triggered the US's scruples. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki warns Beijing, and the word warns is in quotation marks, that if an armed conflict breaks out between Russia and Ukraine, it would, quote, impact China's interests all over the world. The US's such move is like nitpicking with China. This China-Russia document covers broad consensus and common demands on economy and trade, security, regional situation and global order. And it does not even mention Ukraine. Washington's vision is clearly too low to see the real landscape of today's world. It is now more like a class representative of old thinking, proudly flaunting its lies with an old trumpet from the last century. They believe they are smarter than everyone else, but they are giving themselves too much credit. In fact, the China-Russia joint statement stated clearly, peace, development and cooperation lie at the core of the modern international system, and the international community is showing a growing demand for the leadership aimed at peaceful and gradual development. Against this backdrop, Washington still intends to impair other countries and maintain its hegemony by instigating wars. This is a staggering geopolitical daydream. To wake up from such a pipe dream, the bunch of political elites in Washington should carefully read this joint statement and understand how to make the US conform to the trend of the times and become a truly responsible power. Well, this is an extraordinarily insightful statement. It shows a remarkable grasp of international affairs, something that you will not find, by the way, in much that comes out of Western capitals out at the moment, including from Western governments and from Western media. But note specifically the first point, which is, in my opinion, completely true. The party that is taking every step to aggravate tensions in Eastern Europe and to give the impression that war is not only imminent, but is about to happen, and is doing so in a way that seems to suggest that it actually wants a war in Ukraine to take place, is the United States. And China outright accuses the United States of trying to instigate a war between Russia and Ukraine. And the Chinese are saying that the reason the United States wants to instigate this war between Russia and Ukraine is so that it can tighten bloc discipline, it can reinforce its positions in Europe, it can shepherd various European countries back into the NATO fold and tighten its hegemony, the word the Chinese like to use, over the nations of Europe. Now, this article doesn't refer to the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, but in a recent program, I said that one of the purposes, one of the undoubted agendas that the US is following is to try to get Germany to cancel the Nord Stream 2 pipeline by creating this war scare in Ukraine. The United States doesn't want to sanction Germany to force Germany to drop the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, because that might provoke a very hostile reaction within Germany itself and on the part of the German public. So it's trying to get the Germans themselves to drop Nord Stream 2, and it's whipping up a war scare between Ukraine and Russia in order to strong-arm the Germans into saying that they would cancel the pipeline in the event that there was a conflict in Ukraine, which the United States will organize as soon as the Germans say publicly that they intend to do that. Well, you can see how closely that analysis, my analysis about the Nord Stream 2 issue, fits in with the Chinese analysis that the United States is trying to create a crisis in Europe, create a war between Ukraine and Russia in order to tighten bloc discipline, NATO discipline in Europe, trying to corral European states like Germany, Italy, and France back into the NATO system as part of this great geopolitical conflict that the United States is waging against the so-called League of Authoritarians, in other words, the Chinese-Russian de facto alliance, and that this is the United States, or at least the Biden administration's agenda here, and is what is driving its actions. The analysis I outlined in that recent video I did about Nord Stream 2, Germany and the United States, and Olaf Scholz's visit to Washington, and this editorial in Global Times correspond closely. In fact, they overlap and complement each other. And unsurprisingly, I think the Chinese have got it basically right. But the Chinese are also making a number of other points. Firstly, they say that this is incredibly immoral with respect to Ukraine. It is treating Ukraine itself like a pawn, like a sacrificial victim in a great geopolitical game. And I have to say, I agree. And we read increasingly, there's a further article now in the Wall Street Journal confirming the extent to which personal relations between Zelensky and Biden have all but broken down as the Ukrainians resent the way in which the United States is trying to create, or appears to be trying to create, a tense atmosphere on Ukraine's borders, whip up a war scare, and perhaps instigate a conflict between Ukraine and Russia. The Ukrainians are starting to realize the extent to which they are being used. And though, of course, this does not translate so far to any fundamental rethinking of Ukrainian policy, it is indicative of the extent to which even the Ukrainians are starting to become concerned by the way in which the United States is manipulating them and is acting contrary to Ukraine's interests, and indeed putting in jeopardy its very existence. So what the Chinese are saying about the immoral nature of this game is starting to be grasped even in Ukraine itself. But there is a third thing, perhaps the most important point, because of course the second half of the editorial goes into great detail about the Chinese-Russian joint statement that was published following Vladimir Putin's and Xi Jinping's summit meeting in Beijing on the 4th of February, on the opening day of the Winter Olympics. and the extraordinary amount of attention this editorial gives to that joint statement is indicative of something very important. Now, this joint statement, as Global Times points out, doesn't even mention Ukraine. So why talk about it at such length in an editorial which is supposed to be about the conflict in Ukraine? Well, there is a very straightforward explanation for this. And if you read this editorial carefully, if you follow the thinking behind it carefully, it becomes abundantly clear why the editorial focuses so much on the joint statement. Because what the Chinese are saying, what Global Times is saying, is that that joint Chinese-Russian statement is in effect a political manifesto. It is an announcement by the Russians and the Chinese, almost a formal declaration, if you like, that they are in effect de facto allies, partners, that they're working together in international affairs and are now providing an alternative pole, both in terms of power and even to some extent in terms, perhaps not so much of ideology, but if you like, of international relations and geopolitical philosophy to that of the United States. It's clear that this joint statement means, for the Chinese at least, a great deal, and it is, if you like, the announcement to the world that this de facto alliance between China and Russia now exists and is a reality. And by focusing so heavily on it in this editorial, the Chinese are warning the United States that this alliance, because that's what it is, this relationship between China and Russia, is solid, it has philosophical as well as economic underpinnings, and that the United States cannot change or alter it, it can't pick it apart, and that threats made by the United States towards China to try to get the Chinese to put pressure on Russia, or blandishments, offers made towards Russia to try to get the Russians to distance themselves from China, none of that is going to succeed, because this friendship between China and Russia is now a done thing. So this is, in its own way, a remarkably important editorial. It shows that the Chinese have figured out that it's the United States that is creating this crisis in Europe, that it's trying to instigate this war between Ukraine and Russia, that it's trying to do this in its own interests or its own conception of its own interests, but that the Chinese-Russian alliance is solid. It offers an alternative approach to international affairs and to global governance, and it has the power to see this challenge off, and it has the future before it. And perhaps the most telling phrase of all, the one which Americans perhaps ought to consider very carefully, is that really vivid phrase about the United States being still locked in the world of the 20th century. Washington's vision is clearly too low to see the real landscape of today's world. It is more like a class representative of old thinking. Class representative is a Marxist phrase. In other words, it says that the United States is a bourgeois reactionary, proudly flaunting its lies with an old trumpet from the last century. They believe they are smarter than everyone else, but they are giving themselves too much credit. Well, that joint statement has gradually come to be read and perceived and discussed in Europe. Josep Borrell, the European High Representative for International Affairs, the nearest thing the European Union has to a foreign minister, he actually spoke with some concern and alarm about it on his blog, noting that with all the focus on Ukraine, people are taking their eye off the ball, and that it's this convergence of China and Russia that is the actual big event in the world today. Borrell, very much to the annoyance of the Russians and to some extent of the Chinese also, said that this shows the growing power of the authoritarians that the so-called democracies must stand up against. I mean, that kind of deeply ideological thinking. But regardless, this political manifesto that the Chinese and the Russians published on the 4th of February is starting to resound, and perhaps more than its actual content, which, to be frank, I found personally a little banal, it is the very fact of its existence, this declaration, this coming out, if you will, that we are now allies, that is indeed resounding around the world. Well, we will see what comes. It's, as I said, very interesting to see China now making its big play, talking about the situation in Europe, lending support to Russia, giving advice to Ukraine, giving advice to Europe, and making it clear that China and Russia are back to back, and that if the Russians do find themselves in some kind of confrontation with the West over Ukraine, a confrontation which the Chinese have made it very clear they consider it is the United States which has instigated, well, in that event, Russia has China at its back. Thank you very much indeed for joining me today for this program. I look forward to you joining me again for future programs, both on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. You can also, of course, find us on our other platforms. I've discussed Rumble and Locals at the start of this program, but do please check us out there. And also, of course, we're on other platforms as well: BitChute, Library, ODYSEE, SuperU, and the rest. And of course, you can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, and you can go to our shop and buy the amazing things that you will find there, our famous magic mugs, the bomber jacket, which I'm now wearing, proudly wearing, which will be available in our shop very soon, and other amazing things that you will find there also. And of course, you can also support us by checking your subscription to this channel and by ticking the like button to this video. Thank you for joining me again for this program today. Look forward to you joining me again. Have a very good day, and more from me soon.